In this episode, I asked my ET guide, Dimitri, two burning questions. The first, you may have heard the statement that humans only use 4% of their brain. This was a statement seconded by my extraterrestrial guide. Science calls that a myth. So why would Dimitri make that claim? Is it about neurons or is it about access? Is the limitation biological or is it perceptual? The second question goes somewhere unexpected. As the president of the Russian Republic claims, was chess invented by humans or was it given to us by extraterrestrials? Was it introduced as a game or is it a training system? A way to teach foresight, pattern recognition, and multidimensional strategy. If intelligence is non-local, then tools like chess may not originate from where we think they do. This episode is simply about inquiry. What do these ideas point to? And what happens when we stop dismissing strange claims and start examining what they explain? This is Non-Local Intelligence, Episode 2. Okay, so we're discussing chess, and we were discussing how it enhances your cognitive performance, essentially. Memory of focus, problem solving, pattern recognition, trains your brain to identify and recall complex patterns, which is a crucial skill. That's probably, in terms of my capacity to channel, I would say that pattern recognition is a strong skill that you need in terms of intuition, because part of this ability is about recognizing archetypes. It's like the template level of reality, a much kind of less distinct level of our reality experience. When you do energy work and when you work with these kind of principles, if you, for example, if you work with the elements in your energy work, and it may sound quite woo and quite mystical, but the idea of fire is somewhat archetypal, right? The element of fire. If you say fire, there's so many different things that I could relate to fire. There's sensations, there's visuals, there's colors, there's feelings. I might relate anger to fire. Why? Why would you relate anger to fire? Why? Because the power and the intensity and the raging of the fire is similar to the power and the intensity and the raging of anger. And so these are very naturally within our psyche, there are these archetypal patterns that we relate to. And when we drop into the archetypal patterns, then we begin to understand synchronicity as it shows up in our reality. Like if I am angry and I also turn red, that's like the fire within me. So what if I were to do a ritual then where I worked with the notion of fire? Then I would be utilizing that anger and directing it towards a particular goal through the ritual. And subsequently, synchronistically, I would experience that would manifest in my experience of life in multiple ways, because we're working through these archetypal patterns all the time. So on a deeper level, on a more unconscious level, we feel the archetypal patterns before we feel the material experience that they create. The idea that chess increases your pattern recognition skills, I would say that's a strong skill for humans to develop their intuition. So this idea that we only use 4% of our brain, Dimitri, I'm calling you in now. This idea, because you told me that we only use 4% of our brain. He said, yes, I did. And the president of the Russian Republic, he said the same thing. We only use 4% of our brain. Now, if we look at neuroscientific studies, they have evidence through neuroimaging that we actually use all of our brain when we're processing information. So where does this idea come from? There's a conflict there in what we seem to understand through our scientific exploration and what is being called a myth, that we only use 4% of our brain. So he just said, well, a myth is a myth is a myth. I don't know what that means. What are you alluding to, Dimitri? The premise of a myth is that there is always something within the context of the myth that leads to an early understanding of what is to emerge at some later time given the right circumstances. An idea is never just an idea. A myth is never just a myth. These possibilities cannot emerge within the psyche if they do not exist somewhere in the field. It is just like the idea that the brain cannot construct new information itself. It can only understand and assimilate information that is already available to it in order to construct novel ideas. Therefore, a myth is never a myth. A myth is never an entirely made-up construct. It exists because you have engaged with it. Even as a myth, it exists in some context, in some form within the field. And there may be other expressions of yourself, parallel versions of yourself or others, entire collectives that do exist within what you call the myth, where the myth may be true for them. Now, despite this need for clarification, we urge you to understand that there's an interesting paradox present here, or perhaps irony, in the idea that those who are examining the brain, who create the constructs around what a brain is, how it works, and create measuring tools in order to examine the brain, those individuals are in fact only using 4% or less of their brains to do so. And therefore, how is it possible for them to understand whether they are using the entire brain or not? Of course, we see that you examine the neurological patterns that are ignited and utilized within the brain as certain information is engaged with, and you can witness and receive topographical images that may inform you on this matter. However, it is not succinct enough to define that this topographical reading measurement device has identified that the entire brain is in use at any given time. It may be understood that aspects of each brain area are engaged in coordination with one another at any given time, although the whole of each part of the brain will not be engaged at any given moment. Cortical structure is framed around misinformation upon the notion that brain regions operate distinctly or separately to one another, that engagement with different kinds of information lead to the ignitory computational formations within the brain structure that identify patterns upon which reality is formed. There are distinct outliers among you. There are those that have very little brain and operate in a normal fashion. How might one explain these outliers? We would like you to understand exactly where your science is misunderstood. Neuroscience is not the answer when considering the entirety of the brain usage and structure. Electromagnetism carries more of an accurate model in terms of quantum cognition, a framework through which one can begin to understand the relational aspect between the brain and its surroundings. The answers you seek in terms of understanding where might more of the brain be utilized is in the notion of quantum networks engaging in a simultaneous pattern through observation, through directly observed performable task. Electromagnetism gives you the key and opens the door to understanding the true function of your brain. How can one understand how much of the brain is being utilized when one does not understand the true potential of or for the brain in terms of its relationship to its environment? Brain models do not account for the subordinate matter that exists within all forms, all expressions. This is the issue with your external observation of matter. It is framed through your capacity to perceive within the limitations of your belief systems at the time and the knowledge you already possess around the subject. This kind of examination and understanding is very slow in its progression. It does not lead to full and complete answers. It does not allow you to examine the quantum nature of your experience. And since you do not even understand what you are on a foundational, fundamental level, it is very tricky to help you understand the way in which all of your functions truly work. The brain is in use only 4%, and this is relational to its capacity to entangle with various aspects of sentient matter. It is not in relation to areas of the brain that light up when you examine them on an MRI scanner. It is in relation to the qualitative dynamic of the experiencer or within the experiencer. And it is in relation to its capacity to engage with other larger, more dominant organs in terms of electromagnetism, such as the heart. This notion is more about relationship and connectivity than distinct functions and ignitory responses. To understand the full purpose and use of the brain is to more fully understand the quantum nature of your experience, and in knowing how to manipulate it. It is largely a relational dynamic between the brain and the heart that supports the function of shifting, of frequency awareness, or moving between the constructs of space and time. The notion of the mind is more than the brain and more than the heart. The notion of the mind is more likened to a simulated electromagnetism, electromagnetic fields, the chemical reactions that are ignited via the electromagnetic fields, and the sensory proponents that are encased within that dynamic expression. However, this perspective should not be forced upon the collective sooner than they are ready to accept, sooner than they are ready to expand their thinking beyond the parameters of the current schools of thought and acceptable forms of scientific inquiry. 2045, 2047 will be a period of experimentation in the more quantum nature of your brain function and structure. What you call the mind will be explored and expanded upon to a vast degree, and everything expresses itself in accordance with the law of gestation. All will come to this common understanding at the time that is right for both themselves and the collective. For those who are ready to embrace a new philosophy in this time and moment, it is possible for them to expand their awareness in this area by practicing the movement of resonance within their mind and body, noticing the patterns within the brain or within the perceptual experience as they shift into the heart center, and intentionally choose to play with the notion of vibration and the qualitative experiences, becoming aware of the qualitative experiences that come about when one is engaged with the notion of vibration, with the play of vibration, to notice the subtle and distinct differences between feelings, thoughts, the quality of light, the quality of colors, the quality of the physical sensations within the body, the interaction effects between themselves and others, perhaps within the same environment. It is to become like an organic tuning device, organic tunable device, an antenna, to begin to become aware of how the antenna is moved from one frequency to another, and to know that the neural networks within the brain are supportive of this mechanism. I think we have given you enough for today. Yeah, I think you have. Wow, that was a lot to dissect. Thanks so much, Dimitri. I wanted to ask you about the chess. Now, so number one, leader, the leader of the Russian Republic, suggested that chess was given to humans by extraterrestrials. Yes, of course, he said, but it is not to be considered in a classical sense of a traveling, he wants to say traveling army, but what he means is like a large group descending upon the earth to present some kind of game or technology in a very spectacular manner. There's a constant entanglement in communication with us and with other beings, since you are biologically incredibly diverse, and therefore you have this connectivity to various sources of information that exist throughout the galactic space. So yes, chess was invented by an individual, but where did the invention come from? The same way that these transmissions came through, the same way that connecting to higher sources of consciousness, higher sources of intelligence allows one to bring through a representation of a higher source of intelligence, which by its very nature creates a greater intelligence within the being who engages with it. This is how quantum networks work. This is how energy works. This is how frequency works. This is how engagement works. This is how themes and archetypes grow within the systems that you experience. And so it might be, if one is if one has a particular desire to believe that there were some magical experience where a being or collection of beings descended upon the earth and presented a very fine physical object that happened to be the game of chess, and they sat and played chess, and they transferred their knowledge on how to play the game to the individual who receives it. If any individual would like to believe that this was the case, then please allow them to do so. Allow them their magical thinking, allow them their illusions or their fantasies, allow this. We would have you understand that in a more pragmatic way, the way in which information is being transferred consistently, and maybe even many times without you realizing or others realizing, the individual realizing, is through the network of consciousness without any physical interaction occurring or any obvious interaction occurring, through the mode of inspiration, through the mode of illumination. Within the mind, these constructs suddenly appear, and it is possible for us to communicate telepathically with you despite your misunderstanding of your capacity to be telepathic and your awareness around your telepathic capabilities. We are still engaging with you, many of you, telepathically all the time, giving you ideas, guiding you in the direction of sustainability, in the direction of higher sources of consciousness, in ways that you can work with the mind or the body or interrelational dynamics in order to create a new construct that offers a heightened state of intelligence or creativity. And so to say that we were to give you the game of chess, perhaps if you were to view it in that manner of speaking, then that could be a belief system that you choose to incorporate. Okay, so if you gave us the chess in that way, if you gave us the chess, and I think you've actually answered my question, haven't you? That you've said basically you're giving us things, inventions all the time to raise our consciousness. So it is the consciousness, the expression of this higher form of consciousness is contained within the object or the game or the system. It's like to give someone chess is like to give them a system of working within in order to illuminate certain patterns within the psyche or the brain. So does it make us more intelligent? Of course. He says, of course. Any practice of systems thinking, pattern recognition, awareness, since to engage with and we would like you to understand this is the notion of non-judgment. Additionally, to be in judgment is to reject part of the network of data that you have access to. The capacity to engage with more of that data is the definition of intelligence, to engage with and synthesize in your own creative, unique way. And so, and we could call this a three-way cycle of engagement, synthesis, and creativity. This is intelligence, not the capacity to know all things, but the capacity to engage with more of the network of information that exists and synthesize it and utilize it creatively in order to express. And so to be in judgment is to reject and to dismiss and to create a barrier between yourself and your understanding of another form of intelligence that exists within, or information that exists within the network of understanding. I just saw a lizard eye, a lizard, and his face and his eye. Why are you showing me lizard? I think he'll tell me in a minute. Sometimes when I get into the channeling, the visual stuff comes in. That sometimes is connected to a completely different thing. To sit in judgment, is to reject, is to nullify, is to cut oneself off from a whole plethora of understanding that exists within the network of consciousness, as it were. There is a great possibility for intelligence to be gained from the experience of engaging with all forms of consciousness, of course. And the more forms of consciousness you are able to readily engage with, understand, synthesize, work creatively with, and express, the more intelligent you become in terms of this notion of consciousness. And so, and this is outside of the model of the thinking of the brain and the body and the physical entity that is you in this moment. And so to be in judgment is to literally choose less intelligence, is to choose not to understand aspects of consciousness that exist within the network of existence. And this is why we profess to you that it is much better, in fact, to accept that this exists and choose not to engage with it. Yes? In accepting it exists, you allow yourself to, you leave the door open to the awareness that this intelligence, this kind of information, this kind of data, this kind of consciousness exists. And yet I'm not at present moment choosing to be in relationship with it. I'm not choosing to engage with it. I'm not choosing to make it an aspect of my experience at this time. And therefore you have not cut yourself off from the knowing. You have not reduced your capacity for intelligence and for the awareness of various kinds of consciousness. And therefore, you increase your level of intelligence. Okay, you just showed me a little, it was like a salamander or a lizard. I'm not sure about the lizard. Maybe he'll come back to that. But let's ask, so chess, does chess directly increase your brain's capacity to be like a transmitter? Antenna, sorry, like an antenna. Does it increase does chess increase your brain's capacity to be like an antenna? I feel like he's saying, well, basically, you know, what I've said is that it comes from a higher state of consciousness. And so it carries the frequency of a higher state of consciousness. And so when you engage with it, you engage with a higher state of consciousness. So naturally, you expand your capacity to engage with more aspects of your reality through expanding your consciousness as you engage with the game, because that is what it is like. It's like a container for that energy, that vibration. So it's interesting because generally we think of like matter and an object as containing a vibration or a thought or something like that, something that is kind of self-contained, that has like constraints, you know. But if we look at a game, we're looking at a system. We're looking at something that initiates a series of actions, a series of thought processes, a series of responses, engagement. It's more of a system, you know. And I guess in that sense is a bit like Tai Chi or martial arts or Reiki, or you know, the chess kind of belongs in a way, feels like, as I'm saying this, it belongs in a way to that realm of these activities that are inspired, that come through. And as people engage with them, they kind of open them up and expand their consciousness. chess is more like that, even though we think of it more as a kind of, it's increasing our logic. It's actually increasing our pattern recognition, which means that, which is kind of comparative, as we already said, to intuition. What do you want to say about the lizard or the reptile that you just showed me? He said it was cute, wasn't it? Yes, it was cute. It wasn't a sort of scary one. It was one of those little sort of gecko-like ones. Very cute. Okay, why? What relevance does it have? You will find out in the near future, he said. Okay. You'll find out. All right, well, I'm going to hold you to that, Dimitri. I will hold you to that. God, is that you? Is that like your, is that part of he said, don't try to guess. Okay, right. So, Dimitri, what do you think what should we talk about next? You have much work to do, he said. Yes, it's true. I have a lot of work to do to put all this together. So, after putting it through ChatGPT, and we're looking at where this actually aligns with perhaps emergent theories of the use of the brain, and where it might be symbolic or, something else. So what Dimitri seems to be doing in that explanation is that he's contradicting the frame we use to understand the brain. He's basically saying you're trying to measure the brain with a model that's too small to hold what the brain is. So let's walk through it. The 4% paradox, what he's actually claiming. He says there's irony in the idea that scientists are examining the brain with only 4% of their brains. This directly collides with mainstream neuroscience because it's basically not how brains work. We use the whole brain across daily life, and there's constant activity distributed across regions. So if Dimitri is saying literally only 4% of brain tissue is active, that's a contradiction. But what he actually does next is he shifts the meaning away from what lights up on the scan and towards something else. Coordination versus isolated parts, activity versus localization, qualitative dynamics of the experiencer, and the relationship between the brain, the heart, and the environment. So it starts to sound like 4% isn't an anatomical claim, it's a capacity claim. Like you're measuring the brain's activity, but you're not measuring the brain's range. It's like looking at a radio and saying it's working because the circuitry lights up while having no idea how many frequencies it can actually tune. So where he correlates with real neuroscience is when he says you can observe what lights up in topography, but it's not succinct enough to conclude the whole brain is in use at any given time. And honestly, modern neuroscience doesn't think the entire brain is maximally engaged all at once like a light bulb at full brightness. What we do see is dynamic recruitment of networks, changing patterns of connectivity, and coordination across systems depending on the task and the state. So this is where his transmission aligns with the move away from one region does one thing towards network neuroscience, connectomics, the idea that function emerges from connectivity patterns, not isolated modules. So when Dimitri says cortical structure has been framed around misinformation, that regions operate distinctly, the direction matches a genuine trend. Localization isn't wrong, but it's incomplete. And connectivity is often the more powerful explanatory unit. And when he says computational formations that identify patterns upon which reality is formed, this is actually fascinating because it maps onto something mainstream, but with a different kind of flavor. In cognitive neuroscience, there are domain models where the brain is basically a prediction engine. It identifies patterns, builds models, and updates them based on sensory error. So the idea that the brain computation identifies patterns that shape perceived realities, close to how contemporary perception models frame experience. Where Dimitri goes beyond mainstream is the scope. He's implying the pattern formation isn't just internal representation. He's implying pattern formation is participatory and relational with environment. It rhymes with current work that looks at cognition as embodied extended and dynamically coupled to the world. So let's go now to the outliers, the people with very little brain who function normally. And if anybody studies psychology, you will know about these people. This is one of the anomalies that everybody studies at a very basic level, because there are clinical case reports that become famous for exactly this reason. One of the most cited is a 2007 case report describing a man with severe hydrocephalus, where much of the cranial volume is fluid and the remaining brain tissue is compressed. Yet he lived a relatively normal life. And Nature, the magazine Nature, covered the same case because it challenges simplistic assumptions about structure to function mapping. Now, these cases are rare, but they do support a key point. The brain can reorganize massively. The function is not a simple more tissue, more mind equation. That aligns with Dimitri's argument that our models of how much brain is being used might be missing something fundamental. So he also said that neuroscience is not the answer. Electromagnetism is the key. Mainstream neuroscience absolutely includes electromagnetism. EEG and MEG are literally measuring electrical magnetic activity. But Dimitri is implying something stronger. The electromagnetic field is a better model of mind, maybe even causal. That is not consensus. However, there are actual published theories proposing that the brain's EM field could be central to consciousness or integration. John Joe McFadden's CMI field, that's conscious electromagnetic information field theory, is one example, and he argues the EM field could integrate information across neural computations. Again, this is not mainstream, but it's a real research adjacent proposition. So where this correlates to, our common understanding is that brain activity is fundamentally electrodynamic and field-like. Where it's emergent is that field-based integration theories exist, but they remain debated. If we look at quantum cognition, there's a cleaner bridge here. If quantum cognition here means non-classical probability dynamics of the mind, that correlates with a real research field. So then he pivots to some strong themes in his transmissions. He reframes the percent of brain usage as relational to the qualitative state of the experiencer, the capacity to connect, and the engagement with the heart as a dominant electromagnetic organ. And actually heart rate variability and autonomic regulation correlate with executive function, emotion regulation and prefrontal control. Basically, the body state of the heart is deeply tied to cognition. So the heart influencing clarity, regulation, cognitive range is not woo, it's physiology. Where Dimitri extends it is into shifting frequency awareness and moving between space and time. That's obviously metaphysical language. Research doesn't currently validate those claims as stated, but research absolutely supports the idea that state shifts change perception, cognition, emotional interpretation, and a felt sense of reality. And that's the practical overlap. So to summarize it in one sentence, Dimitri is not arguing that most of the brain is asleep. He's arguing that our scientific models may be measuring activity without measuring capacity, and that more brain usage might mean more coherence, more connectivity, more relational tuning, especially through brain-heart dynamics and field-like models. Okay, based on that, Dimitri, do you have anything specific you'd like to add to what ChatGPT has given us in analyzing the kind of relationship between what you've given in the transmission and what we see in our scientific community? He said, "Do not pretend that you know what all of this means." You're absolutely right, Dimitri. I don't know what all of it means, but I still would like to present it as, okay. So what's your advice there? The divine correlates of existence are met with resistance by your peers or populations. We seek only truly to expand the possibility of thought beyond the current networks and frameworks, the capacity to examine certain phenomena. And so placing the idea within the realm of possibility, within the conscious mind of various individuals, within the collective mind, is planting the seed that eventually blooms into something. And it's not necessary to be defined by any individual what that becomes. It has its own organic expression, and it will grow in its own unique manner, and you will experience it in your own unique manner. And so our presence here is really to offer modes of thinking, what could be possible in terms of emergence and development within your communities of science, within your philosophical communities. There is a need for a philosophical mind to be reborn into the scientific community in order for it to extend its desire for adventure, for exploration, for allowing the process to lead the scientist, not the scientist to force the process upon which they dominate what is truth and what is valuable for the masses. Science should be an exploratory experience, one that is magical in its essence and feels exciting to make discoveries that have great purpose and are of great service. Additionally, much of this philosophy has been lost, and we aim to ignite some thought processes around this particular element of your understanding. The relationship here to present scientific constructs is marginally important in terms of understanding that there is some foundational connection to it, but it should not contain the information, it should not limit it, and it should not instantly dispel the possibilities that can be retrieved from engaging with creative thought around the information that is presented here. And so a balance must be sought between making these connections and links to present understanding without containing it to the degree that it is instantly dismissed. Okay, good.